The fluorescent lights of Whitmore Regional Airport hummed their eternal monotone, casting that peculiar shade of institutional white across polished floors that had witnessed thousands of departures, thousands of reunions, thousands of ordinary moments that evaporated into memory without consequence. It was a modest facility, the kind that served mid-sized cities across the country, neither grand nor forgettable, simply functional. On the morning of October 14, 2003, those same lights illuminated what would become one of the most confounding mysteries in aviation security history, though nobody present that day could have known it. The autumn air outside carried the first real bite of approaching winter, and inside, travelers moved with that peculiar mixture of purpose and resignation common to anyone navigating the rituals of modern flight. Garrett Ashford walked through the automatic doors at precisely 6:47 in the morning. Security footage would later confirm this with the cold precision that only digital timestamps can provide. He carried a single leather briefcase, worn at the corners in a way that suggested years of use rather than neglect, and wore a charcoal suit that marked him as someone accustomed to business travel without being ostentatious about it. His face, captured in grainy resolution by the entrance camera, showed neither particular anxiety nor excitement. He looked, in every measurable way, like a man engaged in a routine he had performed dozens of times before. Garrett was 41 years old that morning, a regional sales director for a medical equipment company based in Whitmore. Those who knew him described a man of moderate habits and reliable character. He had been married to his wife Simone for 16 years. They had 2 daughters, both in middle school, both involved in activities that required the kind of scheduling coordination that defines suburban family life. His colleagues knew him as competent and pleasant, the sort of person who remembered birthdays and contributed to office collections without needing reminders. He was not the kind of man who inspired dramatic stories or seemed destined for mysterious circumstances. The flight he intended to catch that morning was equally unremarkable, Flight 327 to Denison, a journey of approximately 90 minutes, scheduled to depart at 8:15. Garrett had made this trip at least once a month for the past 3 years, visiting client hospitals and medical centers throughout the region. His briefcase contained sales reports, product catalogs, and a novel he had been working through for the past 2 weeks. His return flight was booked for the following afternoon. He had told Simone he would call her that evening from the hotel, the same hotel he always used, where the front desk staff knew his name and his preference for rooms away from the elevator. The check-in counter was staffed that morning by a woman named Paula Hendricks, who had worked at Whitmore Regional for nearly a decade. She would later tell investigators that she had no specific memory of Garrett, which was not unusual given the volume of passengers she processed daily. The automated system showed that he checked in at 6:52, 5 minutes after entering the building. His boarding pass was printed. His identification was scanned. Everything proceeded according to the standard protocol that had been repeated millions of times across thousands of airports. He had no luggage to check, only the briefcase and a small carry-on bag that met size requirements. There were no flags in the system, no alerts, nothing whatsoever to distinguish this transaction from the countless others that occurred that day. After check-in, passengers naturally progressed toward the security checkpoint, and it was here that the narrative entered its strange territory. The security area at Whitmore Regional consisted of 2 scanning lanes, both equipped with standard metal detectors and X-ray machines. 4 cameras covered the space from different angles, providing what security managers considered adequate surveillance of the screening process. Garrett appeared on camera 3 at 6:55, joining the modest queue of early morning travelers. There were perhaps 8 people ahead of him, and the line moved with reasonable efficiency. What happened next, or rather what did not happen, would perplex investigators for more than a decade. Garrett reached the front of the security line. The timestamp read 6:58. Camera 3 showed him placing his briefcase and bag on the conveyor belt. Camera 4, positioned to capture the opposite angle, showed him stepping toward the metal detector. And then, in a manner that defied both logic and the comprehensive coverage of multiple recording devices, Garrett Ashford simply ceased to appear on any camera in the entire airport. The immediate assumption, when his absence was first noted, was technical failure or human error. Cameras malfunction. Recording systems experience glitches. People reviewing footage make mistakes. But as the investigation deepened in those first hours and days after Garrett failed to board his flight and failed to arrive home that evening, the technical explanations crumbled under scrutiny. Every camera in the airport was examined. Every recording was reviewed frame by frame. The security checkpoint cameras showed other passengers moving through without interruption. The gate area cameras showed the usual pre-boarding activity. The cameras covering the terminal, the baggage claim, the parking areas, the emergency exits, all of them had been functioning normally throughout that morning. Garrett had entered the airport. He had checked in. He had proceeded to security. And then, somewhere between the metal detector and the gate area, he had vanished without leaving any visual trace of his passage. Simone Ashford received the first phone call at 3:30 that afternoon. It came from someone in Garrett's office, asking if she had heard from him, mentioning that he had missed his morning meeting in Denison and was not answering his cell phone. The concern in the caller's voice was still polite at that point, still residing in the realm of minor worries rather than genuine alarm. Perhaps he had overslept. Perhaps his phone had died. Perhaps there had been some miscommunication about the schedule. Simone felt the first flutter of unease but kept her response calm. She tried his cell herself, heard it roll to voicemail, left a message asking him to call her. By evening, when multiple calls had gone unanswered and inquiries to the airline confirmed that Garrett had never boarded his flight despite checking in, the unease transformed into something sharper and more urgent. Simone contacted the Whitmore Police Department at 7:15 that evening. The responding officer was patient, but explained the standard waiting period for missing persons reports involving adults. Garrett was a grown man who had, as far as anyone knew, simply failed to appear for a business trip. There were many innocent explanations. People had personal crises. People made impulsive decisions. The officer took information, but made no promises about immediate action. It was airport security that first recognized the situation as genuinely anomalous. When questioned about whether Garrett had passed through the checkpoint, the security staff checked their records and found the expected entry scan, but no corresponding exit or boarding. They pulled the camera footage, expecting to see him perhaps becoming ill, perhaps turning back, perhaps taking a phone call that led him to leave the terminal. Instead, they found the inexplicable gap. He entered the frame. He did not exit it, not through any visible door or corridor or passage. The police investigation officially began on the morning of October 15th, less than 24 hours after Garrett walked through the airport doors. Detective Miles Brennan was assigned as lead investigator, a 20-year veteran of the department who had handled everything from routine thefts to complex fraud cases, but nothing quite like this. His first step was to verify the camera evidence himself, sitting in the cramped security office at Whitmore Regional, watching the footage over and over, each viewing confirming what seemed impossible. Garrett's car was found in the airport long-term parking lot, exactly where one would expect it to be. The interior revealed nothing unusual: a travel mug in the cup holder, loose change in the console, everything suggesting a man who had parked with the intention of returning in a day or two. His cell phone records showed no calls or messages after 6:30 that morning, around the time he would have been driving to the airport. His bank accounts showed no unusual activity. His credit cards had not been used. Every digital footprint that modern life creates simply stopped that morning at Whitmore Regional Airport. Detective Brennan expanded the investigation outward in concentric circles, following standard procedure even as the fundamental strangeness of the case gnawed at him. He interviewed Simone extensively, gently probing for any indication of marital problems, financial stress, depression, anything that might suggest Garrett had planned to disappear. Simone answered every question with a combination of patience and growing desperation. Their marriage was solid. Their finances were stable. Garrett had shown no signs of emotional distress. He had been looking forward to their older daughter's upcoming volleyball tournament. He had mentioned wanting to replace the deck behind their house before winter. These were not the concerns of a man planning to vanish. Colleagues painted the same portrait of normalcy. Garrett had been in good spirits at work. His sales numbers were strong. There had been no conflicts with management, no disciplinary issues, no indication of professional problems. The day before his disappearance, he had attended a routine staff meeting and participated in planning for the next quarter. A coworker remembered him mentioning a restaurant he wanted to try in Denison, a casual comment about looking forward to trying their seafood. The investigation examined every person who had been in the airport that morning, a logistical challenge that required cross-referencing flight manifests, employee schedules, and security badges. Dozens of interviews were conducted. Every security guard, every airline employee, every maintenance worker, every traveler who could be identified and located was questioned. No one remembered seeing anything unusual. No one reported any kind of altercation or disturbance. The morning had been, by all accounts, utterly routine until the moment it became anything but. Theories emerged, as they always do when facts refuse to arrange themselves into coherent narrative. Had Garrett staged his own disappearance? The lack of financial preparation argued against it. People who plan to vanish typically move money, create false identities, leave some kind of trail, however faint. Garrett had done none of these things. Had he met with foul play? The absence of evidence made this difficult to pursue. There was no body, no witness to violence, no indication of struggle. The airport security footage showed no suspicious individuals, no one following Garrett, no one approaching him. The possibility of terrorism or some kind of security breach was considered and investigated by federal authorities, who briefly took interest in the case given its airport setting. But again, the evidence led nowhere. Nothing else had happened that day. No threats had been made. No devices were found. If Garrett had been taken, if he had been targeted, the mechanism by which this occurred remained completely obscure. Months became a year. The active investigation gradually cooled as leads exhausted themselves, and Detective Brennan reached the frustrating conclusion that without new evidence, the case could not move forward. The file remained open, but the reality of limited resources and other demands meant that Garrett Ashford's disappearance settled into that painful category of unsolved mysteries. Simone continued to call the police department periodically, asking if there had been any developments, her voice carrying the weight of accumulating grief and unanswered questions. Their daughters grew older in the shadow of their father's absence, learning to navigate holidays and graduations with an empty chair that nobody could explain. The airport continued its operations uninterrupted. The same cameras recorded the same angles. Travelers passed through security checkpoints without incident, thousands upon thousands of ordinary journeys that began and ended as expected. The security staff changed over the years. Paula Hendricks retired. New systems were installed. Technology improved. The world moved forward in the way it always does, patient and indifferent to individual tragedy. But the recordings remained, stored in digital archives that expanded yearly accumulating data that no one had reason to review until a cold afternoon in February 2016, when a security guard named Derek Mao, conducting a routine audit of archived footage as part of new data management protocols, decided to examine the files from October 2003. He had heard the story of the disappearing businessman, one of those local legends that gets passed around among staff, usually late at night when conversation turns to the strange and unexplained. Derek was methodical by nature, the kind of person who read instructions completely before assembling furniture, who maintained careful records and found satisfaction in organizing systems. He pulled up the footage from October 14th, curious to see for himself the mystery that had stumped investigators 13 years earlier. He watched Garrett enter the building. He watched the check-in process. He watched the approach to security. He saw the exact moment where Garrett seemed to step out of documented reality. Derek rewound the footage, watched it again, slowing the playback, examining each frame with the enhanced resolution that modern screens provided. The original investigation had been thorough, but they had been working with the technology available at the time, smaller monitors, less sophisticated analysis tools. Derek had the advantage of years of technological progress and the patience of someone with no particular deadline. It was on his fourth review, frame by frame through the security checkpoint sequence, that Derek noticed something that made him lean closer to his monitor, his pulse quickening with the recognition that he might be seeing what no one else had caught. The detail existed in the margins, in those spaces between one documented moment and another where the eye naturally glosses over in search of more obvious narrative. Derek Malloy sat forward in his chair, the glow of multiple monitors casting his face in shades of blue and gray, and replayed the sequence once more. The metal detector at Security Checkpoint Lane 2 had a small maintenance panel on its right side, positioned low enough that most people would never notice it, certainly nothing that would draw attention in the flow of routine airport activity. In the original footage review, investigators had focused on the passengers themselves, on Garrett's movement through the detector, on the natural paths that led from security toward the gates. What Derek noticed, what perhaps only someone with his particular combination of patience and updated technology could notice, was the briefest distortion in the frame rate precisely as Garrett passed through the detector. It lasted less than 2 seconds. A microscopic stutter in the recording, so subtle that it would have been invisible on the equipment used in 2003, barely perceptible even now, unless you were looking for exactly this kind of anomaly. Derek felt his throat tighten as he isolated the frames, zooming in on the timestamp display. The numbers skipped, not dramatically, not in a way that created an obvious gap, but they skipped nonetheless. 6:58 and 42 seconds jumped to 6:58 and 47 seconds. 5 seconds had been removed from the recording, excised so cleanly that only the metadata revealed its absence. He sat back, his mind racing through the implications. Someone had edited the footage. Not all of it, not in a way that would trigger system alerts or obvious investigation, but precisely those few seconds when Garrett Ashford had been at the most vulnerable point of his journey through the airport. Derek reached for his phone, then hesitated. He needed to be certain. He needed to document this properly, to ensure that what he had found would hold up under scrutiny. The last thing this case needed was another false lead, another moment of hope that collapsed under examination. Over the next 3 days, Derek worked quietly, methodically building his case before reporting what he had found. He examined the surrounding footage frame by frame, looking for other anomalies. He found 2 more, each lasting between 3 and 7 seconds, each occurring at camera positions that would have shown Garrett's path beyond the security checkpoint. Someone with access to the security system had carefully removed specific moments from the recording, leaving just enough continuity that casual review would find nothing missing. The editing was sophisticated, the work of someone who understood surveillance systems intimately. When Derek finally brought his findings to his supervisor, the reaction was immediate and escalating. Within hours, the original detective on the case, Miles Brennan, now retired but still living in Whitmore, received a phone call that brought him back into the world he had left behind. He arrived at the airport security office that same evening, his hair grayer than it had been 13 years earlier, his movements carrying the careful deliberation of someone whose knees no longer appreciated sudden motion, but his eyes sharp with the same intensity that had driven him through countless investigations. Brennan watched the footage Derek had isolated, watched it 3 times without speaking, his jaw working in that way familiar to anyone who had worked with him. When he finally turned away from the monitor, his voice was quiet but carried an edge of something that might have been anger or might have been vindication. Someone had tampered with the evidence. Someone with access, with knowledge, with the technical capability to edit security footage in a way that had fooled an entire investigation. The case had never really been about a disappearing man. It had been about a cover-up so carefully executed that it had hidden in plain sight for 13 years. The renewed investigation began immediately, but this time with a different foundation. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was a criminal investigation into evidence tampering, conspiracy, and likely far worse. Federal authorities became involved again, this time with sustained interest. The FBI dispatched a team specializing in digital forensics, agents who spent weeks dissecting every byte of data from the airport security system. They confirmed Derek's findings and went further, discovering that the editing had been done from within the system itself, using administrative credentials that belonged to someone who had worked at the airport during that period. The list of people with the necessary access in October 2003 was surprisingly short. Airport security staff, certain airline personnel, and contractors who maintained the surveillance equipment. Most of these individuals were still living in the area, their lives having progressed through the ordinary rhythms of career and family and aging. Some had moved away, but digital age made tracking considerably easier than it would have been a decade earlier. Each name became the center of its own investigation, backgrounds checked and rechecked, financial records examined for irregularities, relationships mapped and analyzed. For Simone Ashford, the phone call from Detective Brennan came on a Thursday evening in March, nearly 13 years and 5 months after the morning her husband had disappeared. She had been preparing dinner when her cell phone rang, and something in the unfamiliar number made her answer despite her usual caution about unknown callers. Brennan's voice was gentle as he explained the new developments, but no amount of gentleness could soften the reality that the answers she had waited so long to receive were emerging from darkness into painful light. The investigation was active again. There was evidence of tampering. There might finally be truth. Her daughters, now in their 20s, both in college, both carrying the complicated grief of growing up with an absent father whose fate had never been explained, came home that weekend. The family sat together in the living room that had witnessed so many difficult conversations over the years, and Simone tried to explain what she herself barely understood. Someone had deliberately hidden what happened to their father. Someone had known all these years and said nothing. The anger came later, but first there was just a kind of numb disbelief that reality could be this cruel, this calculated. The media discovered the story within days, as they always do when a cold case suddenly ignites back into public consciousness. Local news covered it first, then regional stations, then national outlets that found in the mystery of the disappearing businessman and the edited security footage a narrative that captured public imagination. Whitmore Regional Airport became briefly famous again, though for reasons no one in airport management appreciated. Security procedures were questioned. Past investigations were criticized. The pressure mounted for answers, for resolution, for someone to be held accountable. The breakthrough came not from high-tech forensics or brilliant deduction, but from the human tendency toward guilt and the weight of carrying secrets for too long. His name was Terence Voss, and in 2003 he had been a security systems technician contracted to maintain the surveillance equipment at Whitmore Regional. He was 58 years old when FBI agents knocked on his door on a cool morning in April, his face showing the lines of someone who had not slept well in a very long time. Before they could speak, before they could present their credentials or state their purpose, he said simply that he had been waiting for them, that he knew this day would eventually come. What Terence told investigators over the following hours, documented in interviews that would become central to the prosecution case, painted a picture of ordinary people making terrible decisions under extraordinary pressure. In October 2003, Terence had been struggling financially, his marriage failing, his gambling debts mounting to dangerous levels. He had been approached by someone, a man whose name he claimed not to know but whose credentials suggested connections to organized crime, someone who needed a small favor in exchange for a sum of money that would have solved all of Terence's immediate problems. The favor was simple in its execution, if not in its implications. Remove specific segments from the airport security footage on a particular morning. Create a window of time where someone could move through the airport without being recorded. Terence had convinced himself that it was probably smuggling, probably drugs or contraband, something illegal certainly but not violent, not something that would haunt him. He needed the money desperately enough that he did not ask questions he should have asked, did not consider consequences he should have considered. He had done as instructed, editing the footage from a remote terminal, covering his tracks as best he could, taking the money and paying his debts and trying to forget. When the investigation into Garrett Ashford's disappearance had begun, when Terence had realized that his small favor had been connected to something far darker, he had been paralyzed by fear and guilt. Coming forward would have meant admitting his role, facing criminal charges, potentially putting his own life in danger if the people who had hired him decided he was a liability. So he had said nothing, had watched the investigation struggle and eventually go cold, had carried the weight of knowing that somewhere Garrett Ashford might still be alive if Terence had made different choices. But Terence's confession, as valuable as it was for understanding the mechanism of the cover-up, still did not answer the central question. What had happened to Garrett Ashford in those edited moments? Where had he gone? Who had taken him and why? Terence could not provide these answers. He had never known the ultimate purpose of his actions, had been deliberately kept ignorant as protection for everyone involved. The investigation now had proof of conspiracy but still lacked a victim, still lacked a clear motive, still lacked the evidence necessary to bring complete justice. The FBI worked backward from Terence's confession, tracing financial transactions, identifying associates, building a network of connections that slowly revealed a larger pattern. Garrett Ashford, it emerged, had not been random. 3 weeks before his disappearance, he had witnessed something during one of his sales calls, an interaction in a hospital loading dock that he had not understood the significance of at the time. Medical equipment was being loaded into an unmarked van, equipment that according to shipping records should have been going elsewhere, inventory that was being diverted and sold illegally. Garrett had mentioned it to a colleague, just a casual observation about what seemed like odd logistics, not realizing he was describing a sophisticated theft operation that involved hospital staff, equipment suppliers, and buyers on the black market. Someone in that network had recognized the threat that Garrett posed even if Garrett himself did not. Someone had decided that the risk of exposure was too great, that the operation was too profitable to allow a witness, however inadvertent, to remain a variable. The plan had been coldly efficient. Learn Garrett's travel schedule. Identify the next time he would be passing through an airport, create a gap in surveillance, and remove him in a location where disappearances, while rare, were at least conceivable. The airport had been both the trap and the misdirection, a place where the focus would naturally turn to systems and procedures rather than to what had happened before Garrett ever arrived there. This reconstruction of events took months to piece together, built from financial forensics, witness statements, and eventually cooperation from lower-level participants in the equipment theft ring who agreed to testify in exchange for reduced charges. The picture that emerged was of an operation that had been running for years, stealing and reselling medical equipment worth millions of dollars, an operation that had finally collapsed under the weight of its own paranoia and violence. Several of the key figures had died in the intervening years, natural deaths that nevertheless frustrated prosecutors hoping for comprehensive justice. Others were arrested, charged with conspiracy, theft, and eventually with murder, though proving the last charge without a body remained legally challenging. Garrett himself remained missing, and this absence became the painful center of every development. Simone testified before a grand jury, describing the husband who had been taken from her, the years of not knowing, the daughters who had grown up with questions that should never have been theirs to carry. The courthouse in Whitmore filled beyond capacity on the days when the main trial proceeded, the community coming together to witness something that felt like accountability, even if it could never feel like complete justice. Convictions were secured, sentences were handed down. People went to prison for their roles in a crime that had begun as theft and escalated into something far darker. But still, no Garrett, no remains, no grave, no place for his family to visit and mourn properly. The convicted conspirators either did not know or would not say what had been done with him after those edited seconds at the airport security checkpoint. The prevailing theory, supported by circumstantial evidence but never proven, was that he had been subdued immediately after passing through the metal detector, during those brief moments when the cameras showed nothing, and removed from the airport through service corridors that connected to the parking structure. From there, he had been taken somewhere, and what happened next was speculation built on grim probability rather than confirmed fact. The investigation officially remained open, though the active phase had concluded. Detective Brennan, who had come out of retirement to see the case through, finally allowed himself to step back, his health no longer supporting the intensity that the work demanded. He met with Simone one final time, in a coffee shop near the courthouse, and they talked about closure and how it was a word that meant something different when the ending remained unknown. Simone thanked him for never giving up, for returning when new evidence emerged, for fighting to bring whatever justice was possible. Brennan said what he always said to families in these situations, that he wished he could have done more, found more, answered every question instead of just some. Whitmore changed in subtle ways after the trial, the way communities do when they are forced to confront darkness in their midst. The airport implemented new security protocols, new oversight systems, new auditing procedures designed to prevent what had happened from ever happening again. Whether these measures were effective or merely performative depended on who you asked, but they represented at least an acknowledgement that the system had failed catastrophically. Memorial plaques were discussed but never installed, the administration uncomfortable with permanently marking the location as a site of tragedy. Simone established a foundation in Garrett's name, focusing on supporting families of missing persons, providing resources for private investigators when official channels reached dead ends, advocating for better training and procedures in law enforcement. Her daughters joined her in this work, channeling their grief into something constructive, finding purpose in helping others navigate the terrible limbo of not knowing. The foundation grew steadily, funded by donations and grants, becoming a respected voice in conversations about missing persons cases and the gaps in systems meant to protect people. Years continued their patient accumulation. Derek Malley, the security guard whose attention to detail had cracked the case open, left the airport and went back to school, eventually becoming a digital forensics specialist, his discovery having revealed an aptitude he had not known he possessed. Terrence Voss served his sentence in a federal facility, his testimony having earned him consideration but not forgiveness, his own family having fractured under the weight of what he had done. The other convicted conspirators disappeared into the prison system, their names fading from public memory as newer crimes captured attention and outrage. But for Simone and her daughters, for the colleagues who had worked with Garrett, for the community that had watched the case unfold across more than a decade, the absence remained present. The memorial services they held, first on the 10th anniversary of his disappearance and then again on the 20th, drew smaller crowds each time but no less sincere emotion. Garrett had become a symbol of senseless loss, of the way ordinary lives could be shattered by forces beyond their control or understanding, of the importance of the work done by those who refused to let the missing be forgotten. The letter arrived at the Foundation office on a Tuesday morning in late September, nearly 17 years after Garrett had walked into Whitmore Regional Airport. It was handwritten, postmarked from a small town 3 states away, the return address belonging to a nursing home called Riverside Gardens. Simone opened it herself, as she did with most correspondence, expecting perhaps a donation or a request for assistance. Instead, she found herself reading words that made her hands begin to shake, that made her lower herself slowly into her desk chair, because her legs would no longer reliably support her weight. The letter was from a hospice nurse named Margaret Chen, writing on behalf of a patient in her care, a man in the final stages of terminal illness who had something he needed to confess before he died. The patient's name had meant nothing during the trial, had never appeared in the investigation, but Margaret had done enough research to understand that what her patient needed to say was connected to Garrett Ashford's disappearance. The patient was lucid enough to provide details, specific enough to be credible, and desperate enough to unburden himself that he had asked Margaret to reach out to the family, to offer them something that had been denied for so long. He wanted to tell them where Garrett was buried. Simone sat in her office for nearly an hour, the letter in her hands, unable to move or think clearly beyond the single pulsing reality that she might finally have an answer to the question that had defined half her life. When she could finally function again, she called her daughters, then called the FBI field office that had handled the original investigation, then called Detective Brennan, who was now in his 70s but whose voice, when he answered, was as sharp as ever. Within 2 days, arrangements had been made. A team of federal agents, forensic specialists, and local law enforcement from the town where the nursing home was located prepared to follow the information the dying man was willing to provide. The man's name was Raymond Kepler, and he had been a truck driver in 2003, working routes that took him through Whitmore and surrounding areas. He had also been, he confessed with the flat affect of someone beyond caring about consequences, an occasional contractor for the same criminal network that had ordered Garrett's removal. Raymond had been the one to transport Garrett after the airport, had been the one to take him to a location outside the city, had been present when decisions were made that Raymond now, facing his own mortality, could not carry to his grave without speaking. He provided coordinates, descriptions of landmarks, details that would allow investigators to locate what he called the burial site. The excavation happened on a cold morning in October, the anniversary timing coincidental but feeling somehow inevitable. Simone chose not to be present, could not bear the thought of watching as dirt was carefully removed and sifted, as flags were placed marking evidence, as the machinery of forensic investigation processed what she knew in her heart would be confirmed. Her daughters stayed with her, and they waited together in the hotel room the FBI had arranged, waited with a patience born of years of practice, waited for the phone call that came just after noon. Remains had been found. Dental records would be needed for positive identification, but the location matched Raymond's description, and the timeline was consistent. There were personal effects: a watch that Simone recognized from the description, a wallet that had been left with the body, perhaps as some minimal acknowledgement of the person whose life had been ended. The remains would be transported to the medical examiner's office, would be processed with care and respect, would eventually be released to the family for burial. Simone received this information sitting on the edge of the hotel bed, the phone pressed to her ear, her daughters on either side of her. When the call ended, they held each other and cried, not from surprise but from the release of tension that had been held for nearly 2 decades. There would be arrangements to make, another service to plan, this time with the finality that had been missing from all the previous memorials. There would be reporters to face, statements to prepare, the renewed attention that always accompanied developments in cases the public had followed. But first, there was just this moment, this confirmation of what they had known but could never quite accept until it became material fact. Garrett was dead. He had been dead since October 2003, had been taken from them in those edited seconds that Derek Malley had finally revealed. And now, finally, he could come home. The funeral took place on a Saturday in early November, under skies that threatened rain but never quite delivered. The cemetery was located on the southern edge of Whitmore, a place of rolling hills and old trees whose leaves had mostly fallen, leaving bare branches that crossed against the gray sky in patterns that looked like careful deliberation. The gathering was smaller than the memorial services that had come before, more intimate, composed of people who had carried this specific grief for so long that its weight had become part of their fundamental structure. Simone stood between her daughters, all 3 women dressed in black that seemed both appropriate and insufficient, watching as the casket was positioned above the plot that would finally, permanently, hold Garrett Ashford. The service was brief because what could be said that had not already been spoken across 17 years of waiting? The minister, a woman who had counseled Simone through the worst periods of not knowing, offered words about rest and peace and the end of long journeys. Colleagues from the medical equipment company, those who remained and remembered, stood in a small cluster, their faces showing the particular sadness of people confronting their own mortality through the loss of someone they had once known in the casual way of workplace relationships. Detective Brennan attended, leaning heavily on a cane, his presence representing both official closure and personal commitment to seeing this through to whatever end was possible. But it was the presence of Raymond Kepler's daughter that created the strange emotional complexity that defined the day. Her name was Alice, and she had reached out to Simone through the foundation, a contact that had required enormous courage given her father's role in the tragedy. Alice was in her mid-30s, a high school teacher living 2 states away, someone who had built a life deliberately distanced from her father's choices, but who could not escape the genetic connection to someone who had participated in murder. She had written to Simone asking if her presence at the funeral would be an intrusion or an insult, offering to stay away if her attendance would cause additional pain, but wanting somehow to bear witness, to acknowledge what her father had taken. Simone had surprised herself by responding that Alice should come, that there was room in this grief for complexity, that the sins of parents did not automatically transfer to their children. So Alice stood at the edge of the gathering, not integrated into the family group, but not excluded either, her face showing the kind of anguish that comes from inherited shame. When the service concluded and people began to file past the casket, offering their final respects, Alice approached Simone with visible trepidation. What Alice said was simple and inadequate in the way that all apologies are inadequate when the harm is irreversible. She said she was sorry. She said she knew words meant nothing against what had been taken. She said her father's confession, his willingness to finally reveal the location, had been the only decent act in a life largely defined by selfishness and cowardice, and even that had come only when he had nothing left to lose. Simone listened, and then did something that surprised both of them. She embraced Alice, held her while the younger woman wept, offered forgiveness not for Raymond but for Alice herself, releasing her from a debt she had never actually owed. The moment was witnessed by several reporters who had maintained respectful distance during the service, and the photograph that resulted, of Simone holding Raymond Kepler's daughter beside Garrett's grave, became one of those images that transcends its immediate context to represent something larger about grace and the possibility of healing. It appeared in newspapers and online publications, accompanied by articles that tried to capture the full arc of the story, the disappearance and the investigation and the final discovery, the 17 years of absence and the complicated closure that came at the end. In the weeks that followed the funeral, Simone found herself experiencing emotions she had not anticipated. There was grief, certainly, fresh and sharp despite the years of preparation, because the confirmation of death stripped away whatever small irrational hope had persisted in the deepest parts of her mind. But there was also something else, something that took her time to recognize as a form of freedom. The not knowing had been its own kind of prison, trapping her in a permanent present tense where she could neither fully mourn nor fully move forward. Now, with Garrett buried and the investigation concluded, she could begin the process of integrating this loss into her history, rather than having it dominate her current reality. Her daughters experienced their own versions of this shift. The older one, Melissa, who had been 13 when her father disappeared, and was now 30 with a family of her own, found that having answers allowed her to finally discuss him with her own children in concrete terms rather than vague uncertainties. She could tell them about their grandfather, show them photographs, share memories, locate him in the family narrative as someone who had lived and been loved and been taken too soon rather than as a perpetual mystery. The younger daughter, Claire, who had been 11 and was now approaching 30, channeled her processing into her work with the foundation, throwing herself into helping other families with an intensity that Simone recognized as both healthy purpose and potential avoidance of her own emotional needs. The criminal cases that had resulted from the investigation reached their final conclusions in the year following Garrett's burial. Raymond Kepler died in hospice care 2 weeks after providing his testimony, his confession having earned him nothing legally but perhaps something spiritually, depending on what framework of judgment one applied. The other convicted conspirators exhausted their appeals and settled into serving their sentences, their names fading from public attention in the way that criminals do once the immediate drama of their trials concludes. The families of victims, not just Garrett but others who had been harmed by the medical equipment theft ring, formed a loose support network, finding solidarity in their shared experience of loss caused by greed and callousness. Terence Voss, the security technician whose editing of the footage had enabled the entire tragedy, was released from federal prison after serving 12 years of his sentence, time reduced for his cooperation and testimony. His release generated some controversy, letters to editors arguing that his role had been essential to the crime and that his punishment should have been more severe. But the parole board had made its determination based on guidelines and behavior, and Terence emerged into a world that had changed considerably during his incarceration, a world of smartphones and social media and surveillance systems, far more sophisticated than those he had once manipulated. He attempted to rebuild his life quietly, taking a job in a warehouse, living in a modest apartment, attending required counseling sessions and parole meetings. But the past proved difficult to escape. His name remained linked to Garrett Ashford's case in every internet search, his face recognizable to anyone who had followed the story. 6 months after his release, he contacted the foundation, asking if there was any way he might speak with Simone, not seeking forgiveness but wanting to offer something. He was not sure what, an accounting perhaps, an acknowledgement of the full weight of what his actions had set in motion. Simone agreed to meet him, a decision her daughters questioned and her therapist explored carefully in their sessions. They met in a neutral location, a park in a neighboring town where neither was likely to be recognized, sitting at a picnic table on an afternoon when the weather was pleasant enough that other people were present but distant. Terrence looked older than his years, the prison experience having carved itself into his face and posture. He spoke haltingly about guilt, about the impossibility of adequate penance, about how he had told himself the favor he was doing was victimless, just editing some footage, just creating a small gap in surveillance, and how he had learned in the worst way possible that there are no victimless crimes, only crimes whose victims we choose not to see. Simone listened, and when he finished, she told him something that she had been thinking about for years. She said that what he had done was unforgivable in the sense that the harm could never be undone, that Garrett would never return, that 17 years had been stolen from her and her daughters. But she also said that holding onto hatred required energy she no longer wanted to spend, that she had chosen to focus on helping others rather than on perpetuating cycles of anger and retribution. She told him that if he genuinely wanted to make amends, the way to do that was to live a useful life, to find ways to contribute positively to the world, to ensure that the rest of his years meant something beyond the terrible mistake that had defined his past. They did not meet again after that conversation, but Terrence took her words seriously in ways that gradually became apparent. He began volunteering with a prison reform organization, speaking to at-risk youth about the consequences of seemingly small criminal choices, using his own story as a cautionary example. The work was uncomfortable, requiring him to repeatedly confront his shame in public settings, but he persisted, finding in the discomfort a form of ongoing accountability. Whether this constituted redemption was not for him to determine, but it was what he could offer, and he offered it consistently. The foundation that Simone had established in Garrett's name continued to grow, its reputation expanding beyond regional recognition to national scope. The organization developed training programs for law enforcement on handling missing persons cases, created resources for families navigating the specific trauma of ambiguous loss, and advocated for legislative changes that would close gaps in investigative procedures. Simone became a recognized voice in conversations about criminal justice reform and victim support, speaking at conferences and appearing on panels. Her authority derived not from academic credentials, but from lived experience and the practical wisdom gained through years of navigating impossible circumstances. She remarried eventually, 5 years after Garrett's burial, to a man named Thomas who worked as a social worker and understood trauma in professional ways that complemented her personal understanding. The decision to remarry had been difficult, accompanied by complicated guilt about moving forward, about choosing happiness when Garrett could not. Her daughters supported the relationship, recognizing that their mother deserved companionship and that loving Thomas did not diminish what she had shared with their father. The wedding was small, private, focused on commitment rather than celebration, acknowledging that joy in later life often carries the weight of everything that came before. Detective Brennan passed away in his sleep on a winter night 7 years after Garrett's case had been resolved, his death peaceful in the way that his final years had not been, his health having declined steadily after retirement. His obituary mentioned the Ashford case among his notable investigations, but those who had worked with him knew it had meant more to him than most, represented both his greatest frustration and his eventual vindication. Simone attended his funeral, sitting with his family, sharing stories about his persistence and integrity, his refusal to let the case remain unsolved even when every conventional avenue had been exhausted. The police department created a commendation in his name, recognizing excellence in cold case investigation, ensuring that his dedication would be remembered institutionally. Derek Malley, whose careful attention to archived footage had cracked the case open, built a successful career in digital forensics, his discovery having opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. He maintained occasional contact with Simone, sending updates about cases where his work had helped solve other mysteries, other disappearances, other situations where the truth had been hidden in technical details that most people overlooked. He never sought public recognition for his role, uncomfortable with attention, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But Simone made sure his contribution was acknowledged whenever she spoke about the case, crediting him with the observation that had finally brought answers. Whitmore Regional Airport underwent significant changes in the years following the revelation of the footage tampering. The security systems were completely overhauled, with new protocols requiring multiple redundancies and external auditing of surveillance records. The administration implemented transparency measures designed to prevent the kind of internal corruption that had enabled the original crime. Whether these changes were sufficient, whether any system could truly be proof against determined malfeasance, remained open questions, but they represented at least an institutional commitment to learning from catastrophic failure. The gate area where Garrett had last been seen, where the cameras had shown him entering security and then simply ceasing to document his existence, became a place that airport staff spoke about in lowered voices, though nothing visible marked it as different from any other part of the terminal. Some employees reported feeling unsettled working in that area, though whether this reflected genuine intuition or the power of suggestion was impossible to determine. The airport considered installing a memorial plaque, but ultimately decided against it, concerned about frightening travelers or drawing unwanted attention to security vulnerabilities. On the 20th anniversary of Garrett's disappearance, Simone and her daughters returned to Whitmore Regional Airport for the first time since the case had been resolved. The visit was private, not publicized, just the three of them walking through the terminal in the early morning hours before the crowds arrived. They stood in the security area, looking at the spot where those crucial seconds had been edited away, where Garrett had passed from documented reality into orchestrated absence. It felt important somehow to reclaim this space, to stand in it without fear or avoidance, to acknowledge that terrible things had happened here, but that the place itself was neutral, just walls and floors and equipment that had been misused by people who made terrible choices. Claire, the younger daughter, had brought a small framed photograph of her father, a picture from a family vacation years before his death, showing him smiling and relaxed in a way that captured who he had been beyond his role as victim in a crime story. She showed it to one of the security guards, a young woman who had not been born when Garrett disappeared, and briefly explained who he was and what had happened. The guard listened respectfully, then asked if she could share the story with her colleagues, ensuring that the people who worked here understood the weight of their responsibilities, the real human consequences of security failures. Simone agreed, recognizing that Garrett's story, as painful as it was, could serve a useful purpose in training and awareness. The foundation established a scholarship in Garrett's name, awarded annually to students pursuing careers in criminal justice or forensic science, fields where careful attention and ethical integrity could make the difference between solved and unsolved cases. The first recipient was a young woman who had lost her own brother to a still unsolved disappearance, who spoke at the awards ceremony about how Garrett's case had inspired her to seek answers not just for her own family, but for others trapped in the same limbo. Simone sat in the audience listening to this speech, tears running down her face, recognizing that meaning could be constructed even from tragedy, that Garrett's death, while senseless and cruel, had created ripples that touched lives he would never know about. She often thought about those edited seconds, about what Garrett had experienced in the moments after passing through the metal detector, before he realized that something was wrong. Had there been pain? Had there been fear? Had he thought of his family, called out for help that never came? The investigators had been deliberately vague about details, protecting her from information that would only create more vivid nightmares. She had not pressed for specifics, recognizing that some knowledge, once acquired, could never be unknown, and that she had to trust her own limits about what she could carry. What she chose to remember instead were the 24 years she had shared with Garrett before he was taken, the ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but that memory had elevated to precious. The way he had made breakfast on weekends, elaborate productions involving pancakes and bacon that left the kitchen in disarray, but filled the house with warmth and laughter. The way he had attended every one of their daughter's school events, sitting in uncomfortable auditorium seats or standing in cold weather at soccer fields, present and attentive in the way that mattered most. The way he had held her hand while watching television in the evenings, absent-minded connection that signified safety and partnership, and the deep comfort of chosen family. These memories were what she worked to preserve, to pass on to grandchildren who would never meet him, but who deserved to know him as more than a case file, more than a cautionary story about crime and investigation. She created albums, both physical and digital, collecting photographs and writing descriptions of the contexts in which they had been taken, providing narrative that would otherwise be lost to time. She recorded videos telling stories about Garrett, about how they had met, about his habits and preferences, about the jokes he made and the things he cared about, creating an archive of personality that would survive her own eventual passing. Her daughters did similar work, each in their own way. Melissa wrote a memoir about growing up with an absent father, about the ways that loss had shaped her understanding of family and commitment, and the fragility of ordinary life. The book was published by a small press and found a modest audience, particularly among people who had experienced similar tragedies. Claire incorporated her father's story into her advocacy work, using it as a case study in the importance of persistent investigation and the value of families refusing to let the missing be forgotten. Together, they ensured that Garrett remained present in their lives, not as a ghost or a wound, but as a complete person who had mattered, who had been loved, whose absence had left a permanent mark but had not destroyed the people he left behind. On quiet days, Simone sometimes visited the cemetery, sitting by Garrett's grave in weather both fair and foul, talking to him about developments in their daughters' lives, about the Foundation's work, about the ways the world had changed in the years since his death. She did not believe in supernatural communication, did not imagine that he could hear her in any literal sense, but the act of speaking to him provided its own comfort, a ritual that acknowledged ongoing connection despite permanent separation. She told him about Thomas, about the life she had built in the aftermath of losing him, about her guilt and her gratitude in equal measure. She told him about the people who had been convicted, about Raymond Kepler's confession, about all the answers that had eventually emerged from years of determined investigation. And she thanked him, which might have seemed strange to anyone overhearing, thanking a man who had been murdered for what he had given her family during his life. But Simone had learned that grief and gratitude could coexist, that honoring someone's memory required acknowledging both the loss and the gift of the time that had come before. Garrett had been a good father, a loving husband, a decent person whose life had been cut short by forces he had not understood and could not have prevented. His death was unfair and his absence was permanent, but his life, the actual living of it, had meant something, had created value that persisted beyond his physical presence. The Foundation's annual gala, held each spring, became a major event in Whitmore's charitable calendar, drawing supporters from across the region and beyond. The evening included awards recognizing law enforcement who had gone above expectations in missing persons cases, scholarships presented to deserving students, and testimonials from families who had been helped by the Foundation's resources. Simone always spoke briefly. Her remarks focused on the importance of never giving up, of demanding answers, of ensuring that the missing were counted and remembered and valued. She rarely mentioned Garrett by name during these speeches, her role having evolved beyond personal tragedy to broader advocacy, but everyone present understood that her work emerged directly from her own experience of loss. In her 70s now, Simone sometimes thought about her own mortality, about what would happen to the Foundation after she was gone, about whether the work would continue or gradually diminish as her personal story receded into history. Her daughters had assured her that they would maintain the organization, that it had become something larger than any individual, that its mission would persist as long as families needed support and cases needed solving. This assurance helped, allowed her to feel that Garrett's death had generated something lasting and positive, transformation of tragedy into useful purpose. On the 25th anniversary of Garrett's disappearance, a journalist working on a retrospective piece asked Simone if she had forgiven the people responsible for taking her husband. She had paused before answering, recognizing that the question was more complicated than it appeared. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not a single act but an ongoing process, something that looked different depending on the day, the person, the specific harm being considered. She had forgiven Terence Voss's moment of weakness, recognizing that he had not known what he was enabling, that his crime had been greed and cowardice rather than violence. She had forgiven Alice Kepler for the sin of being born to a guilty father, had released her from inherited shame. But the people who had actually planned and executed Garrett's murder, who had decided that one man's life was worth less than the continuation of their theft operation, them she could not forgive, not in any complete sense, though she also did not spend her days consumed by hatred. What she told the journalist was that she had chosen to focus on living rather than on hating, that anger was exhausting and ultimately corrosive, that she had too much work to do and too little time remaining to spend it on rage. This response was quoted widely when the article was published, held up as an example of grace and resilience, though Simone herself thought it sounded more philosophical than she actually felt. The truth was messier, more contradictory, involving days when she felt generous and days when she wanted to scream at the injustice of it all, days when she could speak calmly about Garrett's death and days when grief ambushed her in grocery stores or at traffic lights, sudden and overwhelming. But she had learned to carry this complexity, to recognize that healing was not linear, that moving forward did not require leaving the past behind, but rather integrating it into a larger understanding of what life could contain. She had learned that people were capable of surviving things they believed would destroy them, that resilience was not a personality trait but a practice, something built through small decisions repeated over time. She had learned that community mattered, that the support of friends and family and even strangers could make the difference between collapse and continuation. And she had learned that meaning was not inherent in tragedy, but could be constructed through deliberate effort, through choosing to let loss generate purpose rather than simply pain. The final image that stayed with people who knew the story, who followed its long arc from disappearance through investigation to eventual resolution and beyond, was of Simone at the Foundation office, surrounded by photographs of missing persons, working the phones and computers with her daughters and volunteers, helping families navigate the worst moments of their lives with patience earned through her own suffering. She had not chosen this work. It had chosen her, emerging from circumstances she would have given anything to avoid. But having found herself in this position, having survived what she had survived, she had decided that the only meaningful response was to ensure that other families received the support and answers she had eventually been given, even when those answers came too late for reunion, even when they only offered the bitter comfort of knowing. In the end, the story of Garrett Ashford was not really about those edited seconds of security footage, though that technical detail had been crucial to solving the case. It was not really about the criminal conspiracy that had taken his life, though justice for those crimes had been necessary and important. It was about what happens after tragedy, about how people continue when continuation seems impossible, about the ways that love persists beyond physical presence, about the human capacity to transform suffering into service. It was about the determination to ensure that the missing are not forgotten, that cases remain open until answers emerge, that families receive the support they need to survive the unsurvivable. Garrett had walked into an airport on an ordinary morning, expecting to board a routine flight, expecting to return home the following day to a life that felt secure and predictable. He had been given no choice about what happened next, no opportunity to fight or flee or protect himself. But his family, in the years that followed, had made countless choices about how to respond to his absence, how to honor his memory, how to let their grief serve purposes larger than itself. Those choices had mattered, had made a difference, had created something that would outlast all of them. The work continued, as it always would, as long as people went missing and families demanded answers and communities recognized their obligation to the lost. The Foundation carried Garrett's name forward, ensuring that his life, however it ended, meant something beyond the crime statistics and case files. And Simone, walking through the office at the end of another long day, pausing to straighten a photograph of her daughters and granddaughters, felt something that might have been peace, or at least acceptance, the recognition that she had done what she could with what she had been given, that she had survived and helped others survive, that love and determination had proven more durable than violence and greed. She locked the office door, stepped out into the evening air, and drove home to the life she had rebuilt, carrying with her always the memory of the man who had been taken too soon, the husband and father who had deserved so much more time, but whose legacy lived on in the work that bore his name and in the hearts of the people who refused to forget him.